Let's continue working with our wireframe document inside of Photoshop. This is part 3 in this video series, and as you can see, we've already created some regions for our homepage wireframe. We have labels on those regions, and our guidelines are turned on, which shows us that we're matching up very nicely against this grid system here. Remember, we can always toggle those guidelines by hitting Command semicolon or Control semicolon. If we want to get them out of our way and just focus on the regions we've created. Okay, I'll leave them on for the time being, and in this video I want to review a couple of important steps that we haven't quite finished up yet for these wireframes, and then I want to answer a couple questions that you may be having about what all this means for the design of your site. So to begin with, we have regions, we have labels. What we're missing at this point is a visual cue as to the relative importance of each of these regions. And we accomplish that by changing the color of our background shapes here. We're going to keep everything grayscale because we're not actually using a color scheme at this point. And these wireframes don't dictate what our colors should look like in the end. So we're going to use different shades of gray to represent the relative weights of each of these sections. And of course, the first thing we need to do is decide for ourselves, in terms of our content, what really is the most important. So looking over this, I may decide that the top stories area is really important, followed by the top banner, and then finally the most recent stories. That's a decision that each of us has to make on a case-by-case basis, depending on our content, depending on our site, our goals, our audiences, and so on. Once we've decided the relative weights of these different regions, it's time to indicate it visually using different shades of gray. So I'm going to, first of all, change my top stories area, and to do this, what we want to do is select the region in our layers panel. So I'm going to click on top stories to select it, and there's a very easy way to change the color of a shape in Photoshop. In order to do this, you're going to want to make sure that your layer is unlocked, that there's no lock symbol anywhere on that layer. So if I click this to lock it, you'll see that I've got a lock on it and I can't do anything with it now. So you can double click that. Whoop! You can click on the lock up here toward the top to unlock it. In earlier versions of Photoshop, actually, you can double click on that lock to unlock it. Either way, you want to make sure the shape is, or the layer rather, and the shape contained on the layer is unlocked, so we can do this. Next thing we want to do is make sure we have the color that we want to apply in the foreground swatch. So right now we have white. Well, that's not what we want to use. We want to change this to a shade of gray. Now, I've decided I have 3 different levels of importance on my wireframes. You may decide you have more, 4, 5 even, or only 2. Once you decide how many levels of importance you have to assign color values, gray values, to each of those levels. Now remember, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0 is pitch black, and FFF is pure white. Values in between, as we increment from 0 to 9, get lighter and lighter, and then once we hit 9, we switch over to the letters, A, all the way to the Fs, which is pure white. So, for a 3-tone variation, some good numbers to work with are first 4, 4, 4, 4, 4, 4. So we'll type that in, and that's going to represent our dark gray color. This is actually very close to the color I already have in play. In fact, it may be identical to that color. Once we've selected it to apply the color, we can hit Option, Delete, or if we're on a PC, Alt, Backspace. So Option, Delete is going to apply that color. It's a little bit lighter than the one I had on there already, and so that's updated. And now to change the color of my other sections. Let's see, I think I said most recent stories would be the next most important. So I'll click on that layer in the Layers panel. I'll come to my swatch and I'm going to make it 888, 888. Click OK. Option Delete applies the color. And then finally, I'll go to my top banner and I'm going to change this to BBB, BBB, and Option Delete applies the color. Okay, now I have 3 different shades of gray representing the relative weights of these regions. The nice thing about using this Option Delete or Alt Backspace key combination is if I had a bunch of additional regions on this page and I wanted to quickly click through and change the color of a bunch of different regions, all I need to do is select it in my Layers panel and then use my key combination Alt Delete to apply the color and move on to the next one. I'll undo that since I don't want that to change. Only thing we need to be careful of as we change these colors is that we're not losing the legibility of our labels. And I feel like for our top label here, top banner, we are losing that a little bit. So I'm going to change that label from a white color to black. And I can do that simply by clicking on the top banner layer inside of my Layers panel. I'll type the T key to turn on my font, and I'll click and drag this and change the color to black and then confirm it. So now I can easily see the label on that region as well. Let me turn off my guidelines here for a better look at what we have. Okay, so now I have wireframes with regions, labels, and colors indicating the shades of gray, I should say, indicating the relative weight of each of these regions. Okay, so these wireframes are in good shape. I can save this document now, which I'll do, to make sure I don't lose all my work here. And let's talk about a few additional issues with these wireframes. One question that may be coming to mind is whether these wireframes mean that your design is going to be very boxy, very blocky. And the answer is most definitely no. It doesn't require you to create a blocky, boxy kind of design. You could if you wanted to, but remember, these wireframe regions are broad strokes. They represent roughly where things are going to go and how they're going to look on the page, and especially how they're going to look. This doesn't mean that I have to actually create these shapes as part of my design. It doesn't mean I need to use these shades of gray, certainly, as part of my design. It does mean that I want to have a region at the top that's 940 pixels by 200 that contains my top banner, and I want to have a region on the right that contains my top stories that's 540 pixels wide, and so on. How these regions actually shape up when my design comes together is really going to depend on the kind of design I want to create. So this is not in any way forcing me toward using a bunch of rectangles and squares in my design. Okay, with that out of the way, a couple of other issues. Let's say I wanted to create a perfectly square shape when I drag it out. Let me turn my guidelines back on here, and I'm going to hit U to go over to my shape tool. Well, I can certainly adjust something after I've created it to make it a perfect square. But to start off that way, I can hold down the Shift key and then click and drag, and this is going to maintain my proportions. Now, the trick with doing this is I lose my ability to snap. So we're going to want to make sure after we do this that the shape we've created really is exactly the width that we intended it to be. For example, I know this should be 380 pixels wide because that's what the shape on top of it is. If I hit Command T to go into free transform mode, though, I see I'm actually only 378, so I'm not lining up exactly. So we can hold down Shift to constrain the proportions, but we do need to be careful when we do that to make sure that we're not losing our snapping against our guidelines. Well, we will lose the snapping, so we want to make sure we're not losing the fact that we're perfectly lined up with those guidelines. Something else to consider. Once we've defined a region like top stories, we can certainly come in here and define some subregions within that main region. So to do that, all we need to do is click and drag shapes over the region we've already created. So for example, we could start here, drag a shape over. All right, there's that subregion in there. And we can always do Command T to go into free transform mode. Make sure that our width and our height are what we want. Let me change the height to 100. and I'm going to change the registration point on this, and I'm going to make the Y position 380. Okay. So there I have a subregion within my larger region, and it's a good idea to label subregions so we know what they're intended to contain. Another issue that may come up is wanting to duplicate a shape once it's created. For example, maybe within top stories I want several of these subregions. A couple of ways we can do that. Let me rename this layer before I get any further, and I'll call it specific top story. Okay, a couple of ways that we can duplicate something we've already created. One of the most basics, if we want to maintain it as its own unique shape, is to right-click on the thing we want to replicate and go to Duplicate Layer. And we can call this Specific Story, Top Story, number 2. Okay, and with that duplicated, I can hit my V key to move to the Move tool. I'm going to hold down the Shift key and then tap the down arrow, and that's going to move the shape that I just replicated or duplicated. And I'm going to move it into position here, and now I have not one but 2 subregions within the top stories area. I can replicate anything I've created and then move it around on my layout as I get everything lined up. Well, those are some additional tips and tricks with working with these wireframes, creating perfect squares, putting subregions into our larger regions, and also remembering that this doesn't mean everything has to be made up of boxes in our final design. And that'll wrap things up for this tutorial.